You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
John Legend, Sheryl Crow, Elvis Costello, and Alanis Morissette star in the MGM Plus original series, Words and Music. Iconic artists share intimate performances and the stories behind the songs. New episodes Sundays on MGM Plus.
It's 7v7 soccer. Smaller the pitch, faster the action. The world's elite soccer clubs compete for their share of a massive $5 million prize. Catch World Sevens on TNT, True TV, and HBO Max December 5th through the 7th.
After the end of the Carolingians in East Francia, or what would later sometimes be referred to as the Kingdom of Germany, the practice of electing the new monarch emerged. This practice had its roots in the pre-Charlemagne era of the Germanic tribes and kingdoms. The king of the Germans, who was contemporaneously styled as the king of the Romans, would always be one step away from becoming the Holy Roman Emperor, requiring the coronation by the Pope to seal the honorific. Otto the Great, the first in the post-Charlemagne era to be officially styled as the Holy Roman Emperor, would be followed by his son and grandson without any electoral fuss, but when Otto III died without an heir, it introduced the first imperial election with some historical record in the year 1002. From the mid-11th century until the death of Frederick II in 1250, the elections were generally a formality to provide a rubber stamp to the designated heir of the most recent emperor. But there were growing tensions emerging amongst the powerful families and political factions. This was the era of the investiture controversy and the struggle for supremacy between the German princes and the Pope. The House of Hohenstaufen, or the Stauffers, with their power base in Swabia, managed to maintain the claim to the throne through most of this era, and were supported by others in the pro-imperial faction that became known in Italy as the Ghibellines. The dominant opposing power was the House of Welf, originally from Bavaria and further extended into Saxony. The House of Welf aligned themselves with the Pope against the Stauffers. The Italians who supported this faction became known as the Guelphs. Frederick II had been deposed by the Pope in 1245, which technically created a vacancy in the official title of the Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick would continue ruling until his death, after which the anti-king, William of Holland, would be fully recognized as the King of Germans. However, no king would be elevated to the imperial title until 1312, giving this period the name of the Great Interregnum. The election of 1254 had the German prince-electors looking outside of Germany. The group of 7 electors, which by this time was clearly established, included 4 secular princes, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg, and 3 ecclesiastical princes, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. The factions split, the Welfs supporting King Henry III's brother, Richard of Cornwall, and the Stauffers supporting King Alfonso X of Castile. Richard won a contested election by a margin of 4-3. After his death, the electors settled on Rudolf, the Count of Habsburg, in 1273. The House of Habsburg had quickly risen from minor status in the Hohenstaufen loyalists to a political force under Rudolf. He would be the first Habsburg king of the Germans. His son, Albert, would not follow him immediately, but did win the election in 1298. And Albert's great-great-grandson, also an Albert, would eventually be elected in 1438. From this time forward, the Habsburgs would go on to own the electoral process and rule the Holy Empire until its dissolution in 1792.
Welcome to the History of Modern Politics. My name is Chris Spangle, and the voice you heard in that cold open was Matt Wittlief, my co-host, and the intellectual genius behind this program. I'm just the monkey that pushes the buttons. Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate it. And
back. Yep.
We're very glad to be back for season 2, and we are excited to get back to work and start producing episodes. Thank you to everybody that listened to season 1. If you enjoyed it, please, the only way to grow this show is for you to spread the word. Share it with your friends, your family. And what we do here at the History of Modern Politics is we started way back in Rome, and we're now building an intellectual history of modern politics. We're talking about Hohenstaufens and Habsburgs and Rudolphs today. And all of this is important because history is one continuous, growing, developing, overlapping system that produces where we're at now. When we started this, Matt, it was like do we start in the 80s with Reagan? Oh, well, we got to go to 79. And then we got to go to Kennedy. Oh, well, we can't leave Woodrow Wilson out. And then finally, when we got to Rome, it was like, all right, we got to just stop here.
We're far back. We're far enough back now. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is eventually leading up to our modern times. And where do these intellectual currents come from for modern conservatives, progressives, libertarians, and, the commies? But we'll get to all of that in future seasons. But this season, we are in the 1200s up to the late 13th century. And where we left off at the end of the first season was various provisions and negotiations that came into effect after that Second Barons' War, shortly after the Magna Carta, in the waning years of King Henry III's reign in the 1260s. Now, we let you know that he died in 1272 and indicated that his son, Lord Edward, would become the next King of England. And we'll get into the details of Kings Edward I, II, and III, which are all very dramatic, in the next episode. But we always like to, even though we're Anglo-centric here, because we've got to have sort of a home base to anchor ourselves to. And since American politics largely came out of England, that's where we're sitting, we still need to have a look at the continent and other parts of the world as we start to develop some of this stuff. Now, there's a lot unfolds during this next period, and to have the proper context, there's a lot of related topics that we've not talked much about over the past season that requires some review. So today, before getting into the next episode, we are going to look at a variety of topics covering their background up to the mid to late 13th century so that we don't have to do a deep dive on those things in these next episodes.
Yeah, otherwise we'd have like a 3-hour episode in our next one.
Right. So give us an idea of some of these topics, Matt.
Yeah, so, we haven't touched on Wales and Scotland and some other things that really start to become important in King Edward I's reign. So we're going to look at histories of Wales and Scotland, the sister countries, if you will, or kingdoms that lived on the island of Britain in this time, still do today, and eventually become very important to the development of English politics and such. We're going to look at what's going on in what's called the Low Countries, most prominently Flanders, but kind of think northern France, modern day Netherlands and Belgium and such. We've touched on them a little bit, but we need to get a little bit deeper there. And then also as we jump into the Edwards, we have things like developing around commercial systems and international trade at new levels that become critical political points and developments that happen. So we're going to look at the evolution of banking, the roles of the Italians and the Jews and some histories there. And then there's also been an undercurrent of law developing, right? That really starts to accelerate under King Edward I. So, we're going to look at the development of law over the years and the influence that universities had there as well. So lots of topics today. We mentioned the electoral process of the Holy Roman Empire in the introduction and kind of bringing the Habsburgs onto the stage. We're not going to talk a lot about them over time because, as Chris mentioned, we're Anglo-centric, but at the same time, international relations are always an important piece of politics. So understanding how things are unfolding in the continent adjacent to our main storyline are also really important.
Yeah, you can sign up to hear this, but we're going to do, you can get early release episodes, email blast, show notes, reading lists. Our show notes are all written out. We've tack on a bunch of reading lists to everyone, to show our homework where we got all this stuff. And we're going to also do some bonus episodes where Matt and I kind of like discuss off script some of this stuff. And we're going to kind of review season 1 and talk about what we learned. But I think what I was surprised by in doing the work for season 1 was how much trade, how much international relations, how complex a lot of these societies that we often think are just basic, barbaric type, England of 800 just must have been, and there's some truth to that. It's certainly not as developed as today or even the 1800s, but what you see through all this, Matt, is just how interconnected things already are on a simplistic scale. And we're just about to pour gasoline on it as we moved into the second season here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, that's a nice segue into talking about the history of Wales, because if you remember from last season, there's only been a couple of places where we've even mentioned Wales, as we've been focusing really on the dominance of the English kingdom, right? If you remember the consolidation of power by Alfred the Great and such.
And tell people where Wales is.
Yeah, so Wales, if you kind of can try to picture what the island of Britain looks like, and to the west, there's that little bulge that sticks out over the foot of the island. That bulge is Wales, right? So it's lying,
kind of heading towards Ireland.
That's right, heading off towards Ireland. So it's a bit above the Foot-like Peninsula, which is called Cornwall in the southwest. And if you recall, the Anglo-Saxons were pressing into England as they went through their migrations and pushing against the Celtic Britons, as we discussed way back in episode 4. And those natives actually ended up settling into Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland up in the north. So when you think back to the heptarchy of kingdoms which ruled England before the unification, that notion of Bretwaldas, or the dominant kings of the heptarchy, is something we discussed. And one of those Bretwalda, Offa of Mercia, ruled from 757 to 796. And, back to your points at the beginning here, Chris, right? There's good evidence that Offa was, kind of a direct peer and had trading relations and even maybe courtly relations with Charlemagne, right, during that time. So one thing, though, that Offa did was construct, or we believe that he constructed not him personally, but ordered the construction of a massive dike, creating a ditch and an earthen wall along the stretch of Western Mercia, which essentially forms the border here with Wales. And so as responsible amateur historians, we want to point out that modern research now does question how much of this was actually done under Offa's reign versus with others, but the name of it being Offa's Dyke has been around for centuries, and it's still named at him, and is more or less the exact border between England and Wales today.
The mountainous terrain and heavily forested territory of Wales was a major factor in keeping the various Welsh tribes and minor kingdoms relatively autonomous. Now, similar to the lands of England during the Heptarchy, Wales continued to be decentralized with only short periods of strong rulers, emerging from one minor kingdom to centralize power temporarily. The Welsh law also generally practiced partible inheritance, which further prevented the consolidation and centralization of power. The English didn't often move into Wales because they were fierce fighters too, so they were fiercely independent, which is why the Welsh language still exists to this day. Not only that terrain, but also the makeup of the people. Now, arguably the most dominant king in Welsh history was, Griffith ap Llewellyn.
Yeah.
Ap is Welsh for son of, who consolidated his power through family and conquest to essentially rule all of Wales by 1055, years before he forged a political union with Mercia by marrying the daughter of the Earl of Mercia. And Mercia is kind of like between Wales and London, right?
Yeah, it's like kind of right in the heart and the center of England.
Yeah, and he negotiated peace with Edward the Confessor to keep Wales and England at peace, but the thorn in his side was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex. You should remember him from episode 7. After the Earl of Mercia died, Harold Godwinson persuaded King Edward to let him attack Wales. Griffith was killed in battle in 1063. Harold Godwinson would take Griffith's wife as his own, and while the King of England would suffer the fate as Griffith in 1066 at the hands of William the Conqueror. Now tell us about those Normans and what they did to Wales.
Oh, so the Normans come in and their rule began to threaten Wales as well. But, the Norman kings of England were never really seriously attempted to conquer Wales because, let's face it, the Normans were kept pretty busy staving off rebellious English natives and the ambitious French lords on the other side of the channel who were ready to try to take advantage of William's absence. An uneasy peace was more or less established and then recognized formally by Henry II in 1171, with a tribute being paid from Wales to England. Then Llewellyn ap Iorwerth consolidated power next and had strength throughout Wales by the year 1200. He made an alliance with our good old friend King John and married his illegitimate daughter, Joan. And as most things with John, this didn't last, and Llewellyn who would go on to be known as Llewellyn the Great, allied with the English barons in the First Barons' War. So Llewellyn was able to continue his hold on power for decades through on-again, off-again skirmishes with the powerful English lords on the Welsh marches. So this is something actually I learned, through the course of, doing all the research for this, Chris. Like, I didn't know what a march was, but marches are essentially, an old word for the boundary between territories. You'll hear a lot in the coming episodes of the Welsh marcher lords and things like that. And that's really just talking about the powerful English nobles who hold territory right on the border of Wales.
Now, Llewellyn the Great died in 1240. Rule of his lands in Wales passed to his son, Dafydd ap Llewellyn, David, basically. Now, David was not the oldest son, but he was the son of Joan and hence a blood relative to King Henry III. Now, he was the first to take the title of Prince of Wales, which will be of interest in our next episode. David died suddenly in 1246 without issue, so meaning no kid. So inheritance reverted to the sons of his older half-brother, Griffith, who died 2 years earlier while attempting to escape imprisonment in the Tower of London. Llewellyn ap Griffith would be able to garner more support than his older brother and ultimately defeated him in battle, and he would become the next Prince of Wales and continue to fight against Henry III and the Marcher Lords. Now, as Henry's power descended, Llewellyn was able to use to his advantage to negotiate a favorable treaty during the height of Simon de Montfort's power. But if you recall in our last episode, Lord Edward, son of the king, had been given lands in Wales by his father. Some of these claims overlapped and would create tension that we will cover in our next episode when we start in on Edward I. Now, Matt, let's move on to the north of Scotland, as this will also be important for Edward I.
Yeah, absolutely. So Scotland, I think most of you all should know, is in the north of England, and thus far in our podcast episodes, we've only really mentioned it in regard to either marriage alliances with the English or military alliances with the enemies of the English. So let's go ahead and get up to speed on the overall history of Scotland and its relationship with England. So as you'll recall from way back in episode 2, the Romans never really advanced far enough to the north to conquer the entire island of Britain. Hadrian's Wall ended up essentially forming the border between the Roman province of Britannia and the tribal clans up to the north. And upon the exit of the Romans, the clans began to evolve into petty little kingdoms, clan-based kingdoms, and form their own dominant territories, just as we saw in the development of the Heptarchy, right? So the difference here, though, is that these kingdoms remained Celtic and they were not Anglo-Saxon. So to the north and the east, there were the Picts. To the far northwest, we had the Gaelic kingdom of Delratia. They held power there. The Gaelic tribes were then related strongly to those in Ireland. And then in the southwest of Scotland, we've got the kingdom of Strathclyde, which emerged. And these people were Bretons, and they spoke a language then that's very similar to Welsh. And then finally in the south and southeast, we have the kingdom of Bernicia. And if you remember the details and you did your homework very well, you'll recall that Bernicia merged with Deira in 654 and formed the kingdom of Northumbria, which was one of those Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the Heptarchy.
Now, the North saw its fair share of Viking invasions, particularly during the same time that the Anglo-Saxons had these threats, which we talked about in episode 6. And just as the Viking threats calmed in the early 10th century under the rule of Alfred the Great and his immediate successors, there was a parallel consolidation of power in the North, moving towards a unified kingdom. This is sometimes referred to as the Kingdom of Alba, which is generally synonymous with the Kingdom of Scotland. King Donald II is usually credited with being the first king of Alba based on a chronicle from the year 900, which was also the year that he died. Always good when you can write the history. Now, the royal line, I was in charge. I was great. The royal line followed a practice called tanistry. This, see, Matt is smart because he writes out the pronunciations for my Hoosier behind now. Now, tanistry, this is described by one definition as the most talented male member of the royal dynasty should inherit the throne, commonly by murder or war. I think that's kind of where the Republicans want to take us. The practice of tanistry ended when King Malcolm III established what historians now call the House of Dunkeld, which would rule Scotland continuously until 1283. Malcolm appeared in episode 7 during the succession crisis of 1066. For simplicity at the time, we said that he allied with Tostig Godwinson and Harold Haralda. And while that's true, the alliance was a bit more indirect. Malcolm III also had interest in supporting Edgar Atheling, as at least one chronicle states that Edward the Confessor had betrothed Edgar's 14-year-old sister to her name was Margaret, to Malcolm in peace negotiations in 1059. Now, regardless of these details, after the conquest by William of Normandy, Malcolm did provide sanctuary to English rebels and refugees, including Edgar, Margaret, and other members of the ousted royal family. Now, despite this, King William did not attack Scotland as he focused on securing his rule in England and Normandy. Malcolm would end up marrying Margaret in 1070, and the Herring of the North created a buffer zone between Scotland and England. Remember, the Herring of the North, he basically created a huge swath of death and destruction between Scotland and England. And in 1072, Malcolm paid homage to King William, securing temporary peace.
Yeah, so that region, Northumbria, which was the primary victim of the Herring of the North, was the primary source of conflict that would then come in the subsequent decades. So this led to a battle led by the English Earl of Northumbria during the reign of William Rufus, whereby Malcolm III and his son were killed in action. You might also recall from episode 8 that King Henry I ended up marrying Malcolm and Margaret's daughter, Edith, which was then Normanized into the popular name Matilda upon taking the throne in 1100. So this in turn created a family line that sided with the Scots loosely with Empress Matilda in the anarchy, as she was the niece of King David of Scotland at the time. So later in the 12th century, during the revolt of King Henry II's sons in 1173, King William I of Scotland used the opportunity to cause trouble in the north. He was soundly defeated, captured, and forced to sign the Treaty of Falaise, which formally then made Scotland a vassal state to England. However, King Richard voided the treaty in 1199 because why, Chris? What did Richard absolutely need?
What?
Money.
Yeah.
Money to go on crusades. So he voids the treaty in return to a massive payment as he was raising money to go off on the Third Crusade. So Scotland then would return into like quasi-fealty with the border between England and Scotland, finally being made official with the Treaty of York in 1237 between King Henry III and King Alexander II, who we'll talk about in the next episode, putting most of the disputed lands that were once in Northumbria into the English counties of Northumberland, Westmoreland, and Cumberland.
Now, in the years following the Norman invasion and reign of Malcolm III, Scotland became increasingly similar to England in custom and law. Scotland adopted the notions of feudal tenure and created earldoms for the leading lords. The Norman-French influence would be felt throughout Scotland, which also opened up diplomatic relations between the Scots and the Capetian kings on the continent. Where was Capatia?
So the Capetian is the royal house that was where the kings of France were from. So they date back to Hugh Capet and Hugh the Great, if you recall, from episode 7 maybe. I don't have that in the notes right off the top of my head.
I mean, there's just so many different moving parts here that, you sort of forget the different houses. So they all sort of...
Episode 5.
Yeah. That's why we provide great notes. So if you were ever quizzed on this by your wife or husband, you can go study. There is one more point about Scotland before we move on to our next topic. While we have focused on Anglo-Scottish relations, the other player in the politics and diplomacy of Scotland is the Kingdom of Norway. Now, we are not going to detour a whole history of Norway here. I'm sorry, Norway fans.
It'd be fun.
I mean, people across the nation are going, aw. But the last time we mentioned Norway was in episode 7 when Harald Haralda was king. Now, those of you who played Civilization 6 on your iPad obsessively like I do know that you can choose him as a character and just go and raid and pillage like crazy. But prior to him, you'll recall, the unfortunately named Canute the Great had unified Denmark, Norway, and England in his personal kingdom. In the intervening years, Denmark split away from Norway. Now, despite their proximity, there was no serious attempt at reunification. And the descendants of King Harold turned their interest west to the islands of the North Sea and, to a degree, Scotland itself. Much of the tension between Scotland and Norway would be over the Isle of Man, the Hebrides, the Shetland Islands, the Orkney Islands. And we'll pick up that story next time. Those are all kind of north of
very north
the island, like really far north, like almost touching Antarctica.
Nearly the Arctic circle.
Arctic. Thanks.
Way up there. So now let's swim across the English Channel. We'll talk about the history of Flanders and the Low Countries. So setting the stage for this region, we need to go back again to episode 5, where I just mentioned, and where we talked about Charlemagne and his descendants and the Carolingian rule of Western Europe. So you'll recall that the Carolingian Empire was split among Charlemagne's 3 grandsons, creating West, Middle, and East Francia. And then there was a whole lot of change as the cousins died at different times, leading to various alliances and battles and treaties. And the political construct of Lotharingia, named after Lothair, one of those original grandchildren, which later then bounced back and forth between West Francia and East Francia. And these kingdoms ultimately became known as France and the Kingdom of Germany, West and East, which the German part is really the northern component of the Holy Roman Empire. The Low Countries, called Low because they existed in the lowlands where the rivers, notably the Rhine, dumped out into the North Sea, ultimately then sat as a border between these two powers. So always on the West Francia, where the French side was the county of Flanders, and to the east of the Scheldt River, where there was a number of regions which all notionally pledged fealty to the Kingdom of Germany. We've got Flanders in the rests northeast of Normandy and includes the port of Calais, which is the closest point on the European continent to the island of Great Britain.
If you remember Dunkirk, that's where Dunkirk happened.
Yes. Yep. And then the region spans parts of modern France, Belgium, and even a small little bit of the Netherlands.
Now, on the eastern side, the Kingdom of Germany established the 5 stem duchies, led by strong dukes who acknowledged a single king beginning in 911 when the Carolingian line was rejected in favor of powerful dukes in the region. The original 5 stem from the duchies that were the Duchy of Franconia, the Duchy of Lotharingia. Say that properly, please.
Lotharingia.
Duchy of Swabia, the Duchy of Saxony, and the Duchy of Bavaria. The Duchy of Lotharingia would split into Upper and Lower Lotharingia. Why'd you have to put that in there so many times? Which would further split into a list of independent entities, including the Archbishopric of Cologne and the Duchies of Holland and Brabant, and the counties of Leuven and Hainault. These are more powerful lands and titles held in Low Countries opposite of Flanders. And correct me if I'm wrong, but like that kind of setup in that part of Germany seems to last for centuries, right?
Yeah,
like,
well into the 1800s before
there's any consolidation.
Yes, under I'm blanking on his name right
Bismarck?
now. Yeah, Bismarck, right? Otto von Bismarck consolidates and actually creates the modern German state. So from this time, you just have like literally hundreds of principalities and quasi-independent states that ultimately all roll up into what at this time is the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, if you remember, that's where Martin Luther escaped to. He was still in Germany, but he was in one duchy, and this guy protected him and from another one, and yeah, so it's all complicated. Now, while the German region of the Low Countries will weave in and out of our story, it is Flanders that had the most direct relationship to England. It was established by Charles the Bald, remember him from episode 5, the king of West Francia. The county was given by Charles as a fief to Baldwin of Flanders in return for his service in repelling Viking threats. His son Baldwin II married the daughter of Alfred the Great, which establishes a dynastic connection between the English kings in the courts of Flanders. Now, a few generations later, we go on to Baldwin V, who we met in episode 7. And if you recall, Baldwin V's daughter, Matilda, married William, the Duke of Normandy, a.k.a. William the Conqueror. Now, we didn't tell you last time, but Baldwin V's sister married Tosta Godwinson, and the court of Baldwin V served as the home for the exiled Emma of Normandy, wife of Athelred, the Unready, and Canute the Great. However, the counts of Flanders would ally more closely with the kings of France beginning in 1070, during the Norman rule of England. Enemies of William the Conqueror, such as Edgar Atheling and Robert Curthose, would have refuge in Flanders, and Sweyn II of Denmark would use it to stage attacks on England. So again, you see all these different links, Matt, between all these different countries and players, and they are giving all kinds of different protections and marriages, and it's all interconnected even then.
Yeah, absolutely. And the link between Flanders and England goes beyond the dynastic and, kind of political alliances, but it's also critical for economics. So English wool by this time had a reputation for its quality dating back perhaps as early as the time of Offa of Mercia, who we talked about in the Welsh part at the beginning here. By the 12th century, there is documented evidence of a growing wool trade between the English and the Germans, and Flanders became the obvious entry point for wool coming across the channel. The cities of the region began developing skills, which would then turn the English wool into cloth for sale. So the Flemish towns of Bruges and Ghent received city charters coming out of the feudal structure, like what happened in London and other merchant cities in northern Italy. This political and economic access between England, France, Flanders, and Italy would be tested in the reign of Edward I. And, I want to underscore here as well, the importance of this notion, right? Cities, as we think of cities today, didn't really exist. And we're not talking about from a population standpoint. It's really having people who are not just performing agriculture, right? It's the notion of skilled laborers, trade, merchants, and ultimately settling in one spot with enough volume of population where it's we don't live in this feudal system anymore. We need our own thing, our own system of government. So while London really is the first city to emerge in England, we actually start seeing more cities evolve here in the Low Countries, which will be important for the development ultimately of democratic systems.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to understate how important the outsourcing of labor to currency, how big of a development that was in human history, because all of a sudden, instead of 1 hour's work in the field to get food, I can now go and do something differently with my time and then pay money that I earned there for other things, which creates a division of labor, right? So a lot of people can do a lot of things, and it's no longer bartering.
That's right.
And so then you start to see the explosions of cities. But right now, you need land to grow food because you have no other way to eat. Now, let's go on to banking, Italians, and the Jews. And this is an important part because obviously the history of the Jews plays an important part in Europe. It's still playing a part in Ukraine, as we can tell. But like we just said, the importance of money starts to develop in this time, Matt. So get us started. Where does this concept of currency begin, and how does it develop in Europe?
So with the growth of the international trade, we see the need for financial innovation, and that leads to the emergence of banking systems, which, to this date don't really exist. So money from different kingdoms are changing hands, required middlemen to help smooth out the process. And so as agriculture grew beyond the level that was simply necessary for subsistence, commodities become available for export out of a lord's manor. And so that starts to grow. And by the 12th century, trade fairs were beginning to emerge in the county of Champagne, which is east of Paris, south of Flanders, and north of Burgundy. So this region serves as a central point for goods between Italy, England, France, and Germany to all come together. The Champagne fairs ran a circuit of 6 towns for 6 weeks each, creating a near continuous center for trade in this hub of Europe. And this also served as a place for goods coming in from Asia, Africa, and Scandinavia.
And it's also important to mention the Crusades because they were a factor in the emergence of banking. Now, in episode 9, we mentioned briefly the Knights Templar. This religious military order was formed in 1119 to protect Christians making pilgrimages to Jerusalem. In the coming decades, the Templars established local offices throughout Europe to provide financial security to those who were coming to the Holy Land. It was expensive to make the journey and to stay in the Holy Land without access to income. The Templars would collect payment locally and provide a note or check to the pilgrim, which was redeemable upon arrival in the Holy Land. Now, this made the journey safer as people did not need to bring massive treasure or supplies with them and be subject to thieves or other disasters. So instead of sitting on the coins and precious metals, the Templars often bought up land, managed estates, and even owned the entire island of Cyprus at one point. Owned being a strong word, Matt.
Yeah, I mean,
I might have butchered for it, but
held all the territory.
They did control it. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you put it into perspective, right? I mean, you're a lord, a high-ranking noble with land and income, but now you're obligated to make this journey to the Holy Land. Like, you got to pay people to get you there. You got to have food all along the way. You're bringing along knights and another retinue of people who have to be fed. Like, what are you going to do? Carry literally hundreds of pounds of silver coins with you? No. So this development of exchange and the process of credit all starts to evolve and emerge here.
Now, the papacy and other Italians took notice. Already a more advanced merchant economy than the rest of Europe, northern Italians borrowed innovations from the Templars and built upon ancient Roman merchant traditions. Now, why Italy? Think about the geography of it. It's between Jerusalem and France, right? Now, they also built on Roman merchant traditions. Now, the merchant banks grew in the Lombardy region, where the loans would be given to farmers in the beginning of the season in return for payment at harvest. Now, in addition to this, the merchant banks would provide insurance contracts against poor harvest seasons to protect the farmers against default. As the merchant banks grew rich, they advanced into the Champagne fairs for more sources of revenue. Pope Urban IV worked with the Italian bankers to create yet another new innovation, securing loans against future tax revenues. Now, Urban IV was pope during the same time King Henry III of England, which was also right in the middle of the battle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Say that correctly?
Guelphs and Ghibellines, yeah.
All right, I got it. He instituted a crusader tax amongst Christians. This steady income stream then provided with the bankers the predictable collateral against which they could lend money to the Pope to fund his wars against the Germans. So you sort of see in the Italians, Matt, like the foundation of the Roman society that was highly advanced, 1,000 years later gives Italians a leg up, even though there had been a lot of destruction of that society.
Yeah, and geographically, they were in a good spot too, with easy access to the Mediterranean and the various ports. So again, another, port of entry as people are starting to bring back things from Asia through the Silk Road or from the Middle East as the Crusaders are starting to find, new things other than fighting the Muslims, trading with the Muslims, right? Because it wasn't always fighting between the Muslims and the Crusader states.
Now, we can't complete the story of banking without the introduction of the role of the Jewish people. Now, obviously, we could do a whole podcast series on just the history of the Jews, so we are going to summarize and cut some corners. There's many great books out there that kind of outline the history of the Jews, which I will add to the book recommendations. Now, Judaism started in the Levant, which is modern-day Israel and surrounding countries, and remained largely in the Middle East until Roman times. Pompey, remember him from episodes 1 and 2, conquered Jerusalem, incorporating it into the Roman Republic. Many Jews were sent into the Roman slave system, beginning a new wave of Jews scattered across Europe, referred to as the Jewish diaspora. Now, discrimination against Jews, Matt, has a long history, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. And it goes back all the way to classical Rome and even before. And the degree of discrimination varied across various times and cultures, particularly in Europe, but began to hit a new peak in the early days of the Crusades. We mentioned the People's Crusade in episode 9, where thousands of Jews were killed by Crusaders on their way to the Holy Land. And most of this is attributed to the notion of some Christians that the Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. This was not Catholic doctrine, but it was a prevalent notion. So when Jews were not being murdered by Crusaders, they were usually left on the outskirts of society. Some were feudal serfs and were excluded from many of the merchant activities due to discrimination. However, there was one job that Jews could often obtain, and that was related to tax collections and money lending. So at this time, most Christians were banned from collecting interest or usury on any financial transactions, but the Jews could do it. So they were more often employed by merchants or bankers to provide the service, which caused indirect gain. And as the merchant banks of Italy grew, royal and noble households had the need for more financial mechanics. Jews were often then employed in that capacity, and many did very well. During the reign of Henry II, Aaron of Lincoln, a Jew, amassed such fortunes through various money-lending activities that there was even a separate division of the exchequer formed simply to manage his taxes owed to the crown. Since Jews became a key source of royal revenue, they often received some protected status.
Until they didn't, and they needed more money, and then they confiscated all the wealth, which was complicated because you were confiscating all the wealth of your barons, too, which we will see, I'm sure, in future episodes. Now, but there were still incidents in England against the Jewish population. Shortly after the death of Aaron of Lincoln at the time of the Third Crusade during the reign of Richard I, there was a massacre of up to 150 Jews in York, spurred on by the Christian fervor of the Crusades. In the 1230s, several towns expelled their Jewish population, mostly, but notably by Simon de Montfort and Leicester in 1231. As Henry III tried to raise funds for adventures such as the Sicilian affair, which we discussed in episode 11, he called on the Jews for funds. They in turn pressed for repayment on loans from ordinary citizens, which further fueled resentment of Jews. In 1255, the first known case of blood libel was prosecuted by the crown. The Jews of Lincoln were accused of ritually murdering a child who went on to be known as Little St. Hugh of Lincoln to use his blood for a sacrifice. Jews had also been required to wear a distinctive badge on their clothing for identification amongst the population. A lot of that sounds really familiar to modern day, and I would encourage people to look up the most dangerous conspiracy theory in the world, and it kind of talks about the history of all of these different accusations. We'll see in the plague, for instance, the blaming of Jews without any evidence. Even with shreds of evidence of where it was coming from, they still blame the Jews because, Matt, they were on the outskirts of society. They had distinctive rituals of washing. It did not affect Jews in the same way because of the ritual washing, and they had, more standards of cleanliness, and they were blamed. And so, anti-Semitism is really rooted in this period, and it's something that we are still fighting against today. We've had a higher incident of anti-Semitism acts of terror over the last year or two than we have in a long time, and it all's rooted right here. You can see threads of QAnon, of the Nazis, of all these different groups of anti-Semitism that promote anti-Semitism, rooted in what we just read, Matt.
Yep. And unfortunate part of all the history and sadly, but again, to understand all these dynamics as we continue to march through the history, we've got to understand the roots here.
Yeah, it just shows you, and Russia has a huge core of it. We'll see in the various pogroms in Europe and Poland, and why did so many Jews end up in Poland and Ukraine during World War II? Well, they had been pushed out in pogroms for hundreds of years out of France and England and into those pockets of Eastern Europe. And so they were highly concentrated. And so this is an important part of the history of modern politics. These ideas that are ancient are passed down generation after generation after generation and are rooted, deeply rooted in our subconscious until we start to examine where those beliefs come from and really take it to task in our own mind.
Yeah. So, moving on to our final section for today is universities and their impact on the law. So one thing that, again, we've only kind of touched on so far in season 1 was the advancement of legal codes and the administrative apparatus of the English royal government. We talked about the advances under Alfred the Great, and the census rolls of William the Conqueror, and the formal structure of advisors that were beginning to solidify under Henry II. And of course, the charters which spoke to the limits of the king, most notably, of course, the Magna Carta. Most of these developments had to do with the personalities of the kings or the political and economic realities of their reigns. But by the time we get into the late 13th century, these new economic realities, population growth, the growth of universities all lead to an inflection point where we see a massive and significant development in the law, which occurred under Edward I.
Now, turning to education, the development of the university happened in the late 11th century and into the 12th century. Prior to this, any notion of higher education occurred almost exclusively in abbeys and monasteries. And this was a pretty insular form of education that attracted mostly locals and nearly exclusively focused on clerical education. 3 universities are generally recognized as the first of their kind. The University of Bologna, founded in 1088 in Italy, the University of Paris, founded in 1150, and the University of Oxford, which has evidence of operation as early as 1096. Now, a minor catalyst for the development of universities was the wave of Gregorian reforms implemented by Pope Gregory VII. You will recall from episode 9 that he emerged as Pope in 1073 after the end of the era of truly awful popes from the Italian aristocracy. Now, the reforms led to an increased need for an educated clergy to support the administrative and legal aspects of the Catholic Church under the direction of the Pope. Now, around the same time, the old legal writings from the East were recovered in North Italy, leading to a pivotal moment in the study and development of law. The body of work which was rediscovered were from the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, and we're going to take a quick detour back to him before we return back to the 11th and 12th centuries.
Yeah, so Justinian became emperor in 527, and during his reign conquered much of the former Roman Empire, which, if you recall, the Western Roman Empire had fallen by this time, including also North Africa from the Vandals, the southern region of the Iberian Peninsula from the Visigoths, and Italy from the Ostrogoths. And this led to an effort to recodify the legal system, drawing upon prior Roman works and his own contributions. The full name of this work is Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, which was then subsequently organized into 4 parts. The first part is the Codex. This is the most famous section, which you will often hear referred to today as the Code of Justinian. This effort was commissioned by Justinian to, quote, create a 10-man commission to review earlier compilations of Roman law as well as individual laws, eliminate everything unnecessary or obsolete, make changes as it saw fit, and create a single compilation of imperial laws in force. This codex ended up containing 12 books and a total of 4,562 imperial edicts.
That's sort of, we may need to do that with American law. Maybe just put together a commission. I'll be in charge of it. The next part was the digest. This was a collection of legal writings and opinions that Justinian and his team felt filled in the gaps of the codex. Another part I'll be in charge of. And elaborated on the interpretation of law. A massive work itself. It contained 50 books, which aimed to fill in the gaps of the codex statutes. And the final 2 parts included the Institute, essentially a training manual on the law, and Novae, a record of laws passed, artful, a record of laws passed after the construction of the Codex. Now, the rich detail in the digest was the work rediscovered, but in Italy, spurring a desire to reconstruct a modern framework of the law. This was a catalyst in the development in the University of Bologna, where students desired to study Roman law. The university was organized and run by students and was granted an official charter by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in 1158 to provide legal protections for students, especially those who came to study from outside of Italy. And Matt, tell us a little bit more about this university.
Yeah, so the University of Bologna was known for both its prominence for civil law as well as canon law, which canon law is the law of the Catholic Church. The University of Paris quickly gained then a reputation for its studies specifically of canon law. The University of Paris was founded as an extension of the cathedral school that was already there and then sponsored by the church itself. And by the mid-12th century, it was internationally famous for its reputation of having the greatest minds of theology and church law. 3 12th century popes, including the famous Innocent III, had studied at the University of Paris. It was also during that time of the controversy between King Henry II and Thomas Becket, which we discussed in episode 10 that was taking place. So Henry at one point sought political arbitration from the university scholars to resolve this issue. But when it appeared that he might not win, he banned the English from studying in Paris, and this really spurred the significant growth in that little university called the University of Oxford, and this all happened in 1167.
Just watched a movie called The Professor and the Madman, based in Oxford. Can't recommend it enough. If you're listening to this podcast, you'll love that movie on Netflix. Now, modern English law has its roots in this era, and the system of law is referred to as common law, as opposed to the other dominant system in Europe known as civil law. Civil law emerged from the study of Roman law and flourished in the development of legal systems in Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and France. English law has already matured to a stable enough system that by the time Roman law was rediscovered and studied, it was too late to have a large influence on English law. Now, most of you have probably heard of the common law, but its definition is sometimes misunderstood. So let's turn back to the work of 1968, The Origins of Common Law by Arthur Hogue, to get a decent definition. Matt, give us some of these definitions.
Sure thing. So and by the way, if you want to get into really geeky understanding of like old law and its development, this is a great book available through the Liberty Fund. So first, common law is a body of general rules prescribing social conduct and applies through the realm. Second, the general rules of common law are enforced and applied by royal courts, whereby the crown asserted a general responsibility for the judicial work of every secular court in the land. Third, common law develops its principles from the grounds of decision and actual legal controversies, that is, precedent. Fourth, common law is marked by an extensive use of jury. Jurors were chosen for their knowledge of the facts of the case, but the court was to apply the proper rules of the law to the facts as the jury had established them. And fifth, common law is marked by a doctrine of supremacy of the law, meaning that all acts of government agencies are subject to examination in the courts.
Now, put that in dummy terms for me. I, of course, understand, but those listening.
I think the best way to summarize it, right, is civil law, which had its roots from Roman law, as we just noted, is very much, prescribed as here's how it's written down. What is written down are the laws. There you go. Whereas common law has this development of a common understanding of the law, which is developed through the application of decisions based on sometimes written law and sometimes just social
precedent.
Yeah.
So civil law, basically, think of Romans. They're oppressive people. You're going to do what we say, and this is what the law says. And the judges are in charge. Whereas in common law, it develops a little more through precedent and through codifying common behaviors and making those laws. And so adjusting to the populace through judgments, which it's more confusing because you got to know a lot of case law in America and England versus just writing the code in places like Australia. Now, English law is first documented in the books called Treatise on the Laws and Customs of the Kingdom of England, which was likely authored by Ranulph de Glanville, the Chief Justiciar of Henry II. Scholars believe his nephew, who was later Chief Justiciar for Richard I, may have also played a large role. In this work, Glanville lays out laws and the rules for legal proceedings, including, most importantly, the types of cases that we subject to royal courts. Henry II had accelerated the use of writs, which can be defined as an order from the king under the Great Seal, commanding a defendant to appear in the king's court to answer a complaint. Every writ was founded on some principle of law. The writ system was standardized and created a process for justice. By the time of Glanville's treatise, there were 39 writs. Over the next century, this had expanded to 471 writs. Most of this growth occurred under Edward I.
And the other treatise that was written around this same time was called the Dialogue Concerning the Exchequer by the Lord High Treasurer Richard Fitz-Neal. And so this document outlines similarly, but specifically the legal processes around the jurisdiction, constitution, and practice of the Exchequer, which, if you remember, the Exchequer is essentially like the Department of Treasury, where all the tax money is flowing in and out of. And so as we saw in the last episode, during the reign of Henry III, it was fraught with the challenges between the king and the leading barons. And during his reign, a new and expanded treatise on law was written, although never completed, by Henry de Bracton. He was a judge in the royal courts, but never rose to the inner circle of the king. His treatise on the laws and customs of England became the foundation for the law under Edward I. And after his father's rule, Edward sought to further codify the legal system and find that right balance between royal prerogative and the freedoms for his people. Through this, he was heavily influenced by his top advisor, Robert Burnell, who was the Lord High Chancellor from 1274 until his death in 1292.
Now, it's hard to believe, Matt, but you had to have all of this information and these little mini histories on these different things to fully understand and appreciate what we're going to talk about over the next 3 kings of England. Because we'll see some moments of power and glory for the kings of England. We'll also see a king deposed from the throne and something that had not happened since the Norman conquest.
Yep, that's right. So I think that covers it for today, Chris. We've gone deep and scratched the surface on a lot of different things that, again, will help us really not have to take massive detours as we go through the first 3 Edwards here.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us here on the History of Modern Politics. If you want to support our work, if you're getting a lot out of this, please go sign up at historyofmodernpolitics.com and become a member. You'll get all the show notes. You'll get the reading list. You'll get early release of episodes, and you will contribute by giving value for the value that you get from the show. We also ask that you please share the show and help spread the word, as that helps us. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Chris.
And we will see you again in a couple weeks.